You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 318 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I have more updates on what happened in Hanoi between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, and some positive news on the Korean peace issue. I'm going to talk about what's going on in the tensions between the nuclear powers India and Pakistan, and updates on Yemen and the absolutely catastrophic, horrific war that's happening there. Share the show or recommend it to somebody. The best place to find it online is at the Libertarian Institute. The show and my daily news roundup are featured there on the homepage. The URL is libertarianinstitute.org. This is a show where I update all the current events going on kind of with the U.S. foreign policy and world events. So make sure that you're subscribing to the show somewhere so you're not missing episodes and details and where sometimes long stories for these wars and different events going on in the world. So it's on iTunes, Stitcher, anywhere you can find all the podcatchers. It should be there. If it's not on one and you want it there, email me and I'll see about getting that up there. And, while you're on there at some point, give me a rating and review on the show. That way the, podcatchers put it out there to more people. So thanks everybody who could do that kind of stuff. You can also support the show and get access to some bonus content that I produce at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so first up today, some things going on in the U.S. One is there's this move by the Trump administration to change the way approvals for small arms sales to foreign countries are handled. And so my guess is that there's companies like Ruger or State Saucer who have, business and, they produce these guns and maybe like AR-15s, handguns, all this kind of stuff in the United States. But then they, there's people all over the world that I'm sure want these weapons, and different countries have different allowances for it. But, there's certainly a desire for people in other parts of the world to have small arms to protect themselves, and the Trump administration wants to make it easier to export these arms. Congress is pushing back on this a little bit. I'll link to the story in the show notes page. That way you could get a breakdown of, who's all doing what and what committee that this thing is kind of being held up in. I think it's actually Bob Menendez that's making the stand for this or against Trump being able to make this move. I'm not sure how much of a good news, bad news this is. I'm always for more trade and easier trade. The problem is that when it's the weapons trade, there's all kinds of state involvement, and you wonder if rather than, let's say some guy in the Philippines getting a handgun to protect himself from local thugs, rather the weapons end up being sold to the Venezuelan opposition, and then that's a method of, kind of arming that group. So I guess there's a scale of results from this possible shift, and exactly how much easier the weapon sales will be to have, with less government oversight. I'm not sure, but it does seem to be a general end run around Congress and kind of taking away Congress's role that they would have in limiting these arms sales. The commander of NORTHCOM, so, there's like European Command, African Command, Central Command, CENTCOM. NORTHCOM is, the United States, North America, put out a statement saying that there's no threat, military threat on the southern border, but there is a drug threat on the southern border. The reason I want to talk about this is because the United States military is actively enforcing, the border security down there, through National Guard and Army forces. Now, this is something that I talked about with Mike Maharrey on the show. He's with the 10th Amendment Center. I actually had some exciting news for him that I'll share here. There have been situations where governors of border states have withdrawn their National Guard forces from that border. Now, there's also a movement that the 10th Amendment Center is trying to start up called Defend the Guard, and what that would do is prevent state National Guards from being used in unconstitutional wars. And so you even have right now presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard, who I think was deployed to a couple tours while she was enlisted for the Hawaiian National Guard. And so let's say this is passed in Hawaii, then the Hawaiian National Guard wouldn't be deploying troops to Iraq, Syria, Yemen, where there's no, authorization for that war. So there's a resolution right now that was passed, I believe a committee in the Virginian lower house, by Pat McGehee, is the one who introduced it. And then I think it got held up, but he's bringing it up again. So, Mike Meharry was very excited about this, and it seems like there are some positive steps on this kind of defend the guard legislation, just because it does make so much sense that, hey, the governor of the state is the, commander in chief of the National Guard. And so, it should be the state rather than the national government that decides if they're ever deployed overseas. If, there's a threat to individual state from somebody overseas, maybe then they do want to deploy their National Guard. But that should be for the governor, to decide. But back to what I was talking about before, you do have Army and National Guard on the southern border, and yet, they're saying there's not a military threat on the southern border. And so, to me, that raises questions of, if the military should be used here. It seems to me to be an admission that the military shouldn't be the ones being used. Now, you could have separate debates about if you're, we need a strong border security kind of person, that we should be hiring more border, patrol units and stuff like that. But I think it's important that it's kept separate between the military, because you don't want military enforcing civilian law in the United States. And the military is enforcing the, threat from Mexico, and that's drugs, and you have the military enforcing drug laws. Now, we already know that there's ties between the war on drugs and the military. Recently, Mance Raider, Pete Raymond, who's been a guest on the show a couple times, did a 2-part interview with David Thibodeau, one of the Waco survivors, as I believe it's the 26th now anniversary of that raid. And they talk about how at one point, I think the FBI or the ATF lied and said that they suspected drugs, because that then gave them access to like military equipment using military tactics. So, we really want to keep this separate, because occasionally the government will burn a whole building full of people alive and kill a whole bunch of innocent people for absolutely no reason. And the greater separation you have between the military and the police, I think the less likely it is to happen. While we're talking about immigration stuff, Rand Paul has come out and said that he will vote against Trump's emergency declaration for the border wall. However, he's doing that through national emergency, saying that it's too much, a usurpation of power from the president. Now, with that, it does seem that there's going to be enough votes to pass a resolution or a bill, I guess, revoking Trump's national emergency, which allows him to take funds from different places to build the border wall. Also interesting here that Trump is getting a lot of this money from the military budget, to build the border wall. And so with, the Northcom commander's statement, it seems that, even the military admits that, this isn't a military threat, and takes away some of the rationale for Trump's emergency declaration there. My guess is that Trump will end up vetoing anything that Congress passes, and so whether or not we actually have Congress get rid of Trump's emergency declaration, I don't know, but it's going to be a big political thing coming up here, and I'm sure by the end of it, I'm going to be really annoyed by it. I mean, it does seem like a lot of people don't have a very non-emotional reaction to this issue, and so from my side, understanding that, yeah, there's property rights issues on both sides of people who either want people to enter or don't, and that, the way the U.S. government works, that the people, have a say over policies like the border wall and everything like that. It just, seems pretty clear to me that, first off, the government is never going to build an efficient wall on that southern border, especially not while the drug wars and being enforced, because as much money as the U.S. wants to spend on that border wall, people want drugs in this country a hell of a lot more, and are going to keep undermining the immigration policy by buying the drugs coming up through Mexico and everything, cocaine. And also, I mean, on this show I talk all the time about multi-billion-dollar government projects that are complete failures, almost to the point where you think they have to be trying to mess it up and ends up so bad, like a destroyer that doesn't have a main weapon. You have this other thing going on here that I'll talk about just real quick. Trump's policy that is going to look to expand here, called the Remain in Mexico policy, which means if you show up to the border seeking asylum, then you get set up with an asylum hearing. I guess, you sit in front of a judge and they say, oh, you're worthy of your life is sufficiently threatened, so you get to enter this country or not. How the hell anybody makes that determination doesn't make sense. And all these, immigration courts and everything have massive backlogs, so I'm sure the asylum courts do as well, and the hearings. And I'm sure there's, aspects of the Trump administration that are intentionally slowing this process down in order to keep people out of the country. But, again, this is a somewhat complicated situation. To decide the fairest way to handle it could be difficult. But, the return to Mexico policy is facing a lot of pushback because, they're forcing people to remain in Tijuana around the border. That way they could go to their asylum hearing whenever it is. However, Tijuana is a pretty dangerous area because of our drug war. And so you have all these problems. I only want to bring this one up because I think, it's a clear thing where if you allow the asylum seekers in before their hearing, then, you have unvetted situations and people who then you have to try to find and remove from the country if they're not granted asylum, rather than having them wait outside of the country, and then if they're granted asylum, they could come in. And then on the inverse of that, you put these people in a very dangerous situation. Some of them are children, and you really don't want to have that happen either. The thing I want to point out is that so much of the problem here is caused by the drug war. It just really upsets me that nobody even will pay attention for a couple minutes to that. And they're all caught up in, what should we do with this immediate problem? I do think that's kind of one of the problems with the way U.S. media and the U.S. government approach issues. And, we reflect this in the war issue as well, is that, it's short-sighted. So, whatever is best for people in the, next 2 or 3 days is what we need to base the decision on. Not looking at the overall scope of the drug war, realizing how much violence it creates from Colombia to Mexico, and then even, into the U.S. and everywhere else in the world too. And that, that's the root of the problem. And if you're only ever worried about kind of what's going on at that second, you're never going to get to that. And so, like Afghanistan, where they say, oh, we can't leave because, all these bad things may happen. You have to look, what are we going to do? Stay there for 100 years like Mad Boot once? Because that's the other option. All right, last up for U.S. news is the Michael Cohen testimony. And I just wanted to talk briefly about this article by Peter Van Buren, largely because there's not a whole lot to say here. I didn't watch the whole thing. I watched all the highlights. I didn't see anything that struck me. The most interesting moment, I think, it was either Massey or Amash. I believe it was Thomas Massey, who asked Cohen when the alleged conversation between Donald Trump and Roger Stone happened, where Michael Cohen says Stone told Trump that he just talked with Assange, and Assange said there's damaging emails coming out about Hillary Clinton. And it turns out that was, I believe, in late July. Now, if anybody remembers 2016 at all, there were emails coming out about Hillary Clinton pretty much that whole year, and WikiLeaks was putting out from, I believe, at least June, but I think as early as March, that they had some of Hillary Clinton's emails. And, there was all the scandal about the missing 33,000 emails anyways. And that was all, Hillary Clinton's fault for setting up the server in her house and then for mishandling how they were turned over. So anyways, what Massey makes clear is that even if Stone got that information from Assange, it wasn't anything that everybody didn't already know anyways. And, therefore there's nothing to it. And so you could go through and read the Peter Van Buren article if you want. He breaks down some of the lesser points of it, but really, just another, again, absolute flop on the part of the Russiagate conspiracy theorist. Because remember, this is worth pointing out real quick here, that this was going to be the thing that buried Donald Trump, was this, Cohen testimony. They've been waiting for this for months. This was going to be a big deal, and it's nothing. I want to update a few things on Venezuela. As I've talked about on the show, the kind of steps that the U.S. has taken towards regime change and, with the help of the Guaido government and the Venezuelan opposition so far really haven't indicated that there's going to be a regime change there. The Maduro government still seems firmly in power. And the story now surrounds whether Juan Guaido is going to return to Venezuela or not, and I guess possibly be arrested. I do think it would be a mistake on the part of the Maduro government to arrest him. I mean, if he returns and you don't do anything about it and he just, goes back to his role as leader of the National Assembly, then I guess coup attempt over and Maduro retains power. I guess if he's running around calling himself president and having rallies all day long, that may present something of a problem. And depending on, how Maduro handles Guaido returning to Venezuela, and then, the propaganda spun off of that, I guess we'll see the direction of whatever regime change effort left is being made. We do have John Bolton seeming to not give up, though, and I think he was on one of the Sunday morning talk shows and made this statement that the U.S. is using the Monroe Doctrine to carry out these efforts, saying that we're looking for an all-democratic hemisphere. Now, the interesting thing here is that, the U.S. democracy is a republic, and we have a electoral college, which means that his president actually wasn't the highest vote getter in the most recent election. Now, I'm not saying that to complain about the electoral college. I'm just making the point that it's undemocratic. Thomas Harrington wrote an important piece that's at antiwar.com and will be linked in the show notes page on the persecution of the Catalan leadership that held the independence referendum for Catalonia in October of 2017. Now, if you'll remember back to that referendum, what happened was the people went out and voted overwhelmingly to make Catalonia an independent state from Spain. This is kind of the Barcelona region of Spain. We saw images of firefighters and old women being beaten by Spanish police. They did everything they could to seize ballot boxes and shut down polling sites. Now, of course, this didn't get the Venezuela treatment as, the U.S. has to do everything possible to uphold democracy, and there wasn't any kind of support given by anybody in the American government towards the Catalan people, and they generally kept their mouth shut about it. Now, it did help, the general cover-up of that is that I think either that night or the next day was the Las Vegas concert shooting that, was a real tragedy for more than one reason, as, it completely covered up this event in a lot of the Western media, especially in the United States. And so the independence vote kind of just went away. Catalonia remained a part of Spain, and the Spanish government pursued the Catalan leadership for, crimes against the Spanish state. And they also made these claims that the leadership used public funds to organize the independence vote. Now, it was documented at the time by international observers that was absolutely not the case. All the funds were privately raised, and it's just made up charge against that leadership to make them political prisoners. So now you have, I believe, the former Catalan president, I think his name is like Carlos, and starts with a BP. That's all I could give you. Living in exile in Germany now, although he was in Belgium at one point. Spain has filed to have him extradited, and both times that was shot down by the European court. And so it's pretty clear that if they, can't even get him extradited to Spain, that there's no real charges against the Catalan leadership there. And so there's, I believe, about 10 or so of those former leaders who have been imprisoned for a year now are facing this farcical charges in, Spanish courts and calling it justice. And, it's just a real shame of what's happening. So some updates on the Trump-Kim summit. The last show I talked about some reports coming out that John Bolton had included the chemical and biological weapons, and that was potentially the deal breaker between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. I haven't seen that story developed anymore, so maybe it just is one of those rumors that turned out to be true, or it was in there but really just wasn't that big of a deal. What the North Koreans offered was to shut down portions of their main nuclear research reactor, nuclear weapon development site. And so I'm not quite sure what those shutdowns would have been, but they would have been, I believe some of them have been identified as the ones key to making nuclear weapons. Now, my guess is that they're not going to dump a bunch of concrete into their nuclear reactor, seeing what the United States did to the Iranians. And, they're only willing to take certain steps. And this is kind of the statement that Kim Jong-un and the North Koreans have made sense, is that, they offered the steps that they were willing to take with the level of confidence they currently have in the United States. Now, my guess is that everybody's playing hardball here, and I know Kim Jong-un is insane. And so, maybe he was leaving himself windows to be able to produce nuclear fuel or to be able to make a bigger nuclear bomb should talks go south with the United States. And in exchange, North Korea wanted sanctions relief for civilian sanctions. And so talking about taking the sanctions off of food, probably fuel, and, different civilian imports. But there would still be, other kind of sanctions against the government and against government officials and all this. So it's not like the world would completely open up with trade to North Korea. This is just specific sanctions relief. Jeffery Lewis had a great take, and I believe he wrote it in NPR on basically what he says, that this actually wasn't that bad of a deal for the United States. It would have gotten North Korea to take more steps and have them laid out before them concrete steps to take, and to ensure that, they're not, moving towards making more nuclear fuel to make nuclear weapons and all of this. And we could get some aid to the North Korean people, and it just progresses the peace process forward. And, the United States has all these other sanctions and tactics like ending the Korean War that they could work with to further push North Korea towards denuclearization. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But that seems to be the kind of the prevailing narrative that I'm seeing as to actually what happened between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un at Hanoi. Now, the good news that has happened since is that the United States announced that they were ending the annual war games, the major ones that happened with South Korea, usually in the spring here, and that those are done with. So I know that the past year that they were postponed, which was great, and they were held off and they didn't happen and they were scaled down. But now they're saying that they're done with. And so this seems to be one of those steps forward. And I'm not sure how much pressure the South Koreans exerted to get this done, or if it was Donald Trump realizing that he needed to make some concessions towards North Korea. But this, from the way I see it, is definitely a step in the right direction. Also going to save some American taxpayers quite a good amount of money. Pakistan and India. What happened on Friday was the Pakistanis returned the captured Indian pilot to India, which, was great. This guy is, held as a prisoner of war, I guess, as a couple days and then sent home. And that seems to be initiated by the Pakistani president, Imran Khan, and he was able to get that done. So I was kind of nervous just because I know that in Pakistan, if the military want to hold on to this guy, maybe they're going to hold on to the guy. And then on Saturday, I believe, the Indians returned a body of a Pakistani man who was beaten to death in an Indian prison after the initial attacks that killed 40 Indian soldiers in Indian-occupied Kashmir. On Sunday, the tensions were way scaled down, and there apparently wasn't any heavy artillery fighting along the line of control that's happened in the past couple days. So maybe we're, moving forward and we're getting ourselves out of the woods here on this India-Pakistan situation. Let's hope that there's no, fighter jets flying over the line of control today and carrying out any airstrikes, and that, tensions could wrap down. Now, the other thing that hopefully could be capitalized on here is that people could take this and say like, hey, we just had two nuclear armed countries bombing each other and talking about going to war with each other. So maybe we need to address this situation a little bit more seriously. The problem is that there's this region of Kashmir that I think the Kashmiri people want independence, or at least to be an autonomous portion of the Pakistani state, whereas the Indians would hope to keep Kashmir all for themselves as part of the Indian state. There's also a good article by Robert Fisk that I'll link to in the show notes page on India's ties with Israel and how Israel is selling India more and more weapons. And so that definitely seems to be something that we should keep our eyes on, and that could be a dangerous relationship. I want to update this story about Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Zayef, I think is his name here. And this is the guy who I believe became foreign minister in 2013 and was instrumental in getting the nuclear agreement done with Barack Obama and the Americans. He's a fairly popular figure in Iran, and it is liked by the Iranian people, specifically the more moderate factions of Iran. And I want to make this comparison, and I really hope not to insult the guy. But, I think you could maybe compare him to Hillary Clinton in 2013, where he is, the foreign minister, the secretary of state. He's very popular, likely or potentially would be the next president of Iran. And so he kind of has that level of prominence, and that's the only aspect I compare him with Hillary Clinton. Now, he resigned about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago after he was traveling abroad and Assad visited Tehran and didn't meet with Zayef. And so he was insulted by this, felt like he was being pushed out. I think he kind of looked at the IRGC, more hardline faction of the government, as doing an end run around him. Soleimani, who is the leader of the IRGC, I guess had organized the visit with Assad. Now, one of the takes on this that I've read that kind of explains the whole situation is from Elijah Magnier, and he's a very trustworthy Middle East reporter, so I'll kind of take his word for this, that basically nobody, even the president of Iran, got more than an hour's notice from the IRGC that Assad was visiting Tehran just because it was so dangerous. Of course, Israel has carried out strikes against, I think, like Iranian diplomatic targets trying to get in and out of Syria. And so having Assad leave Syria is probably a very dangerous and big deal. And this was very complicated. So nobody was notified beforehand. And, the foreign minister felt like, I'm just being pushed out. So what's the point? I'm going to resign. Anyways, I guess this is all explained to him later on. The president, Rouhani, who's also a more moderate, like the foreign minister, doesn't accept his resignation, and he's now back to work, which is a good thing because I think his role in diplomacy with the United States and European countries is incredibly important, and doing everything possible to keep Iran away from completely breaking out of the nuclear agreement, even though the United States stabbed him in the back on it 100%, to not give the U.S. and the warhawks in America the pretext to go to war with Iran, which would be so incredibly dangerous. All right, I want to talk about these islands that I don't know how many people have heard of. They're kind of out in the Indian Ocean. If you look at a map, maybe go south from kind of like Yemen, Oman, and then east from Kenya, Tanzania, and they're the Chagos Islands that are administered right now by the United Kingdom out there in the Indian Ocean. Now, the largest of these islands is Diego Garcia, which you may have heard of because this is the host of an important U.S. airbase. We used it in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and I think even some foreign policy realists say that we should hold on to this base. Now, there were some absolute tragedies as the United States took control of the base on that island, and I think the UK pretty much just rounded the few thousand people who lived there up and shipped them off the islands, and those who didn't want to go were basically starved out. So now the UN court has ruled that the UK needs to return these islands back to the control of the people or the descendants of the people who were forced off the island. It happened in, I think, like the 70s and 80s. Last up on today's show is Yemen, where we had the UK foreign minister travel, I believe, to Oman and meet with Houthi leadership, and then actually, I believe, visiting Yemen. I don't know if anywhere near Houthi territory, but hopefully this is a positive sign in some way. I mean, we're looking at 4 years for this war now, coming up on here at the end of March, and it's 4 years of genocide, and who knows how many people have died so far, but when you're looking at the UN stats and you're seeing, they're saying like 3 million, to 5 million people now like are on the brink of famine conditions. I mean, we're getting to the point where if something doesn't happen very soon, you're going to see a huge number of people just drop dead. And I'm sure it will be like forever societal, changing for the Yemeni people, and it's going to be something that, their country is going to be so much poorer for years to come because of it. And, all these, problems with how the young people today are all malnourished and, not able to go to school. It's really just the most horrific thing happening right now. And so hopefully this week we're going to have votes in the Senate on the Yemen War Powers Act, and the Saudis are going to be doing everything they can, the Emiratis as well. I was just reading an article in the American Conservative. I'll link to it in the show notes page because it goes through and even details the dollar amounts and the senators who received money from American representatives of the Saudi government. So, like a U.S. firm paid to represent Saudi Arabia made a $3,000 donation, a $2,500 donation to a senator on the week of this vote. This is a complete bribe and lobbying effort, and it's absolutely disgusting. And maybe the senators don't understand the impact that their vote is going to have leading up to it here. But, we're looking at things like last spring when we were talking about having these Yemen war powers votes in the Senate. Saudi Arabia is funneling this money to the senators and then it fails. And so, maybe another year of suffering of the Yemeni people by bribes, thousands of dollars. That's it that Saudi Arabia makes to, different members of Congress. And so on so many levels, it's absolutely disgusting. But the important thing is that I don't know how many people have to call their senator's office to, counteract a $2,500 bribe from the Saudis, but I'm guessing it's not all that many. And that, if we're out there and we're telling our senators, hell no, and especially if you read that article and found out that your senator took that money, you should call them and say, hey, you just got bribed off to starve a whole bunch of children to death. How you feel about that? All right. That's our wrap up the show for today. Hope everybody enjoys it. Share it, definitely, and tell people to listen to it. Hopefully you're subscribing to the show somewhere. That way you're not missing an episode, and be back on Wednesday.